If I had a drummer, I'd tell him to play a drum roll right now. And just give me a bunch of, actually, I do have a great drum here. Folks, thank you very much for coming. My name is Loren Schoenberg, and I'm the Executive Director of the Jazz Museum in Harlem, and I'd like to extend warm greetings to you from our Chairman of our board, Leonard Garment, who unfortunately is not unable to be here tonight. He's not feeling well, but he'll be fine, and he'll be back at the next one. And he sends his warmest regards to everyone. Sorry that he can't join us today. I was about to go around and introduce members of our Jazz Museum in Harlem family, but then I realized I'd have to introduce everyone in the room, because everyone here we know you, or we know someone who knows you, so it's a very wonderful small-knit group. But I will introduce just the third part. There's three people that work in this office last few years. It's myself, Leonard Garment, and Wilhelmina Graham right over there, who many of you have met. We all depend on each other. Small bit of history about the museum and what we're doing here just before we start. I'd like to ask you to turn off your cell phones. Talk about you. I'd like to ask you to turn off the cell phones, also your pacemakers and anything else. I'm sorry, I have that wrong. Leave the pacemakers on. But anyway, seriously, it's been 3 years since we started, and we are a not-for-profit, a 501c3, trying to get a jazz museum going in Harlem. We're actively pursuing a site, and we have plans and wonderful consultants and all kinds of great things going. But probably the most significant thing that we've done since we began, we've played at the White House, we've had events up here, we've had wonderful articles and coverages in the Wall Street Journal and the Amsterdam News. What means the most to us is this Harlem Speaks series, and that's because we're throwing the spotlight on people whose careers intersect with Harlem in a significant way. And you're going to find out all about the gentleman who we're saluting this evening, how he intersected with Harlem and so many other places during the course of his long 9-decade-plus life. But before we get to that, I'd like to just introduce in the audience some of our previous guests as Harlem legends and heroes. We have over here one of the wonderful dancers from the Apollo Theater who came up here and mesmerized everybody for 2.5 hours plus. Jackie Taja Murdoch is here. And we also have a gentleman who was in the great Dizzy Gillespie Big Band back when it was the greatest band in the land in the mid-1940s, on all those historic records with people like John Lewis and Kenny Clark and Dizzy Gillespie and James Moody. We have Mr. Joe Gales right here. And another one of the legends of jazz. They say that there's certain kind of musicians that you can hear 3 notes of, and you know who they are right away. And all these musicians are like that. Here's a prime example of someone we're so honored to know, Mr. Joe Wilder. And I should mention that all of our Harlem Speaks events are being videotaped, recorded for the archive. So what you see here is not only a nice session here, but it will be in the museum when the museum happens, and that's going to be very important to us. And of course, we have a gentleman who's going to be a future guest of ours in a couple of months, but has already participated in our Joe Gales evening and is here tonight as along with myself, one of the Benny Carter alumni, the legendary Mr. Jimmy Heath. And I guess the other person who will be participating tonight, who has not been a guest yet, but someone who was born the same year as I was, and we played together when we were 15, so that's many years ago, the great Kenny Washington. Jazz maniac, Kenny Washington. I'd also like to introduce the co-producer of the series, someone who is a mover and shaker and a very accomplished political writer for serious journals, as well as with Harlem World up here, Mr. Greg Thomas, the co-producer of our series. So, to begin, we're not going to be playing that much music for you tonight. It's not a radio show. We're going to be just talking. But before we do, I'd like just to play a little bit of music just to kind of set the stage. We're going to begin with a recording that was made just, what would it be, 13 blocks from here, a little bit northwest of where we're sitting right now. Professor?
Our theme, ladies and gentlemen, Melancholy Lullaby. Time once again to cut short another visit with Benny Carter, his trumpet, his saxophone, and his orchestra. The program originating in the Savoy Ballroom, the home of Happy Feet up here in Harlem, in New York City. Featured vocalist this afternoon was Mercedes.
So this kind of sets the stage a little bit about some music that actually happened, just a hop, skip, and a jump from here. One more piece of music, and then we will get into the centerpiece of this evening's presentation. There's a little bit of a quiz question. We're going to play a recording that Benny Carter made in Europe in 1938, is it? Or 37? 1937. And we're going to ask you the following question. Which instrument is Benny Carter playing on this particular recording?
Track 5. No instrument right now.
Okay. Here we go. Here. White lightning. It's like the Joe Franklin show when they used to play music and people listen. I'll take that any day. Well, of course, this is not exactly, this is much too hip an audience to play a record like that for, because everybody leaned it right away. But Benny Carter played how many instruments on that record?
3. Everything except for the piano.
All the solos were all Benny Carter, the trumpet and the clarinet, and of course the alto saxophone. And for those that don't know, he also recorded on the piano, he also recorded on the trombone, also recorded on the soprano saxophone, and the C melody and many other instruments. And we're going to find out a lot more about it. So I'd like to introduce our panel. To begin with, we have Benny Carter's longtime, I would say, road manager, but much more important, very close, lifelong friend and biographer, who, along with his father, Morrow Berger, wrote what is widely considered to be the best book about an American jazz artist in terms of not only biography, discography, but social context. It's called Benny Carter, A Life in American Music, and the author and the associate director of the Institute of Jazz Studies, Mr. Ed Berger. And I'm very honored to be in the same room with two people who know Benny Carter very well. That's an understatement. His daughter, Joyce Mills, and his wife, Mrs. Hilma Carter. And we're going to begin with Ed, who's going to give us a little bit of context on Benny Carter and Harlem, and then we will turn it over to the family. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here with so many old friends, Benny and me and my family and everybody else. Loren asked me to begin by kind of outlining Benny's ties with Harlem, and so I'll try and do that in less than 3 or 4 hours. And, as you undoubtedly know, he was not born in Harlem, but his career was closely tied with this community. He was raised in a neighborhood known as San Juan Hill, which was on West 63rd Street, just west of what was to become Lincoln Center, where he was to play many times. The neighborhood was also home to Russell Procope and Bubba Miley and later Thelonious Monk. And Benny recalled the thrill of carrying Bubba Miley's horn to the subway each night as he went uptown to play. As a teenager, Benny soon was going uptown himself to Harlem to sit in with whoever would let him sit in at that point as he learned his craft. He recalled that living in Harlem was considered the pinnacle, and in 1923 the Carter family was able to move up to Harlem. His first paying gig was probably at Connor's Inn on 135th Street, where Bubba Miley took him to sub for Ben Whitted, and he got paid $1.25 for the night. At 16, Benny was apparently not the instrumental wizard that he would soon become, because Rex Stewart, who was also subbing up there one night, recalled that the owner finally handed Benny a bunch of flyers to hand out on the corner, saying that that would have been more use for the club than him playing the C melody saxophone. But he quickly progressed, and he sat in with Count Basie at a place in Harlem called Leroy's. He played with Willie the Lion Smith's trio in 1924, and he credited the Lion with helping him make the switch from C melody to alto sax. By 1925 and 1926, Benny had become a sought-after sideman, working with June Clark, Billy Page, and most notably at Small's Paradise with Charlie Johnson's band, where he spent over a year, and with whom he made his first documented recordings in 1928. That same year, he led his own band at the Savoy Ballroom. That orchestra was really the Wilberforce Collegians, which he took over after Horace Henderson left during a tour. At the time, Benny was living here in Harlem on Strivers Row, as 139th Street was known, right down the block from Fletcher Henderson. Next came his well-known associations with Fletcher Henderson and McKinney's Cotton Pickers and briefly Chick Webb. And by 1932, Benny was ready to form his own great orchestra, which played both uptown and downtown, including an early engagement at the Lafayette Theater here in Harlem. He played a long residency at the Harlem Club, which was located on the site of the old Connie's Inn. And unlike many of these venues at the time, the Harlem Club welcomed black audiences, advertising itself as a nightclub for the people of Harlem. And the famous black columnist Roy Otley reviewed the opening in the Chicago Defender, and he wrote, "If you want to attract white patrons, advertise that it is a club for colored people exclusively." A friend of Benny's, George Rich, who Benny described, he played the numbers, he did a lot of things, a very close friend of Benny's and a great supporter of his music. And he was quite wealthy, and Benny was in danger of losing the gig at the Harlem Club because it wasn't attracting enough people. So George Rich bought the club for him so that he could keep playing there. Anyway, a final important chapter in Benny's early saga in Harlem In 1934, it was Benny's band that opened the Apollo Theater's new policy of having name bands and variety acts. Benny's connections with Harlem suspended for 3 years while he was in Europe in 1935 to 1938. When he returned, he lived in an apartment that his sister Edna had found for him at 582 St. Nicholas Avenue. And of course, the swing era was now in full swing, and Benny formed a new orchestra, which spent many months at the Savoy Ballroom. You heard a sample of one of the air checks there. And between 1939 and 41, he was there many, many times. And perhaps the most momentous event that happened at the Savoy Ballroom engagement was that's where he met Hilma. But we'll get to that later. He toured with his band across the country, ending up in Los Angeles in 1943, and he eventually settled on the West Coast and lived there the rest of his life. But he made many returns to New York, many appearances, and a few visits to Harlem, which he always recalled very fondly. And in 1992, he wrote an extended work which actually won a Grammy called Harlem Renaissance Suite, on which both Loren and Kenny Washington played. So that's a brief rundown of Benny's Harlem Association.
Well, I think there's one association with Harlem Renaissance that you forgot to mention, which is that you produced the album. And was nominated for a Grammy himself, so we should put that in there.
Fortunately, I didn't play on it.
Well, I guess, moving back a little bit here, I guess I'd like to turn it over to Mrs. Carter and just ask about that first meeting with Benny Carter. And what was the Savoy Ballroom, and what were you doing there, and how did you get there, and how did it? Just tell us the story, please.
Okay. Well, my older sister was a great jazz fan, and in 1938, when Benny was playing at the Savoy Ballroom, she said, "This great American musician has just come back from Europe, and I want to hear him, and I can't go into a dance hall alone. You'll have to come with me." So these two little farm girls trotted up there, and we fell in love with Benny's music. And obviously with Benny. That was 38, I was 18, and I guess my sister was 21-ish. And so that's how we met.
I was wondering, Hilma, if you could just paint a picture of what it was like going to the Savoy Ballroom up in Harlem at that, how did it appeal to you? What about that vibrant scene that so many of us didn't get to see? And also, could you paint a picture of Benny Carter in 1938, 1939?
Well, Benny was always the cultivated, gorgeous gentleman, very suave, the usual adjective that's called to describe him, a very gentle, cultivated person who could handle every situation. And at the place, or the vibrancy of the place, didn't seem anything unusual to us, because we had our focus in life was to know about everything. Sometimes we'd go to the opera in our evening gowns, and then we would come and listen to Benny when he was playing there. So it was just one of our many experiences growing up and learning about art and culture. So it didn't seem to be anything unusual. I mean, people danced marvelously, and the music was incredible, and so we enjoyed it very much.
At this point, I'd like to introduce Joyce Mills, and just to get the ball rolling, just ask about your earliest memories of your father.
You know, it's hard to ask someone for earliest memories. But I would have to say that I remember that my dad had strict rules for the way he wanted me to behave. And I wasn't that wonderful. My parents were divorced, and when Dad would spend time with me, you would see the nicest little girl in the world. Because he would tell me when I wasn't measuring up. And so I measured up. And my mother always said, your father must have a magic touch because you're not that nice with me.
When was the first time that you actually heard a Benny Carter orchestra, or you actually heard music of his?
I don't know. I mean, in all honesty, I would have to say, by and large, I'm very much aware of having heard him at the Apollo. But when, I don't know.
It was 1938. I saw you backstage at the Apollo in 1938.
Now I can't lie about my age.
Okay.
You outed me.
I have to say that in the audience tonight,
I've never met this man before in my life.
we have in the audience tonight several people who knew Benny Carter back during the heyday, long before Phil or I were born, but back in the 1930s and 30s and on. And I'd like to introduce him. The gentleman you just heard from, who we will be passing the mic over to a little bit later to tell his story, because I'm not going to preview it, is the wonderful writer and early jazz writer and historian Walter Schaap, Wally Schaap. And over here we have, I will give you the mic. Over here we have someone who met Benny. We'll find out later, probably back in around the same era, the jazz filmmaker, writer, and someone who knows everyone, the wonderful Miss Jean Bach. And front and center right here, someone who was involved with Benny personally and musically, and also in many significant ways, the legendary Mr. Ahmet Ertegun. And we've already kind of got this wonderful vibration happening here with all these people who Benny. So I guess what I think I'm going to open the door here to our guests, and we will just have a freewheeling go back and forth with us up here. And I believe that
just say a few words.
Ahmet has to split soon, so we will start with Mr. Ertegun.
My brother, when I came to America in 1935, my brother stayed in France, where he was going to Sorbonne. And during that period, he met both Benny Carter and Coleman Hawkins, who were in France at that time, and became friends with Benny Carter. When Mr. Carter first came back to America and formed his band after everybody returned to America because of the Nazi scare. Everybody in France all came back, and Benny Carter formed a band which he took out on the road. He was breaking them in, I suppose, at the time, and he came and he played in Washington, and he called me. He called my brother, and my brother and I invited him out to dinner, and we thought we were going to go out to dinner together, having forgotten that at that time, restaurants in Washington did not allow mixed people. It was very hard. Anyway, we had dinner at the Union Station, I remember, which was the only place where we could all have dinner together. And we had some other friends as well who were professors at Howard University who were close friends of ours. I remember Sterling Brown, who was with us. And we had a wonderful evening, in spite of the fact of the difficulties at the time. And we have somehow stayed in contact one way or another. And I remember that we were, I think with Mrs. Carter, we spent an afternoon in Washington. We went to museums together. And Benny was always such a treasured friend of ours, and certainly one of the greatest musicians in the history of jazz. And I was in Los Angeles when he was in the hospital. I didn't know how severe his illness was, and I went to see Ray Charles, and Ray Charles told me that he'd been to the hospital the day before to see Benny Carter, and I went to see him the next day, and that was just, I think, a day or two before he passed away, and I was happy that I had the chance to hold his hand. Anyway, before that, his memory lives with every person who knows about and loves jazz. It's an honor for me to be in all your presence, all you so great people here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think we're going to circle around here because I want to hear about Wally Shapp seeing Joyce backstage at the Apollo back then, and then we will work our way around to the musicians who actually and who played with Mr. Carter. Now, his friends call him Wally. I'm not being informal by saying that, but that's Mr. Shapp. I'll put it that way. Could you tell the story of how you met Mr. Carter and your story with him?
I seem to put my foot in it by mentioning 1938, because that was the year I knew Benny best. I first heard him in 1937 when I went to Europe. Of course, I was familiar with him as a great American musician over there, thanks to Barry Yolano. And I went to hear Benny play at a club I think was called Chez Florence. And as I remembered, he was playing with the Willie Lewis Orchestra there. He was featured with them. But in 1938, I returned to Paris to find a cablegram from my uncle telling me that my father had a stroke and I'd better come home at once. So I looked into the Herald Tribune and saw that the Normandy was sailing that very day. There were no transatlantic planes at that time. So I managed to get a passage on the Normandy, which was the great French liner that got destroyed here in New York at the pier a few years later after the war began. But when I got on the Normandy, I looked at the passenger list, and there was the name of Benny Carter, and also the name of Eddie South. And I made damn sure I got seated at the table with him. There were 5 of us at table, besides Benny and Eddie. There was Dave Martin, who was Eddie South's piano player at the time, myself, and an exotic dancer whose name was Lulu.
I'm not going to make the obvious joke.
She was leaving town and going. So I ate all my meals except breakfast, I suppose, with Benny and Eddie, and I was thrilled. And during the voyage, they were invited to give a concert in first class. We all were tourists. And they invited me to come along with them. And I did, and was thrilled by the concert. I ate caviar for the first time and drank top champagne. Now, I knew that I saw you or your older sister at the Apollo in 1938, because I went to hear Benny at the Apollo that very year. And I remember Benny's daughter was there backstage, and so was Ben Webster. I don't remember who was in the band anymore, but it was a great evening. Ben Webster, incidentally, was one of Benny's greatest admirers. He always looked up to him.
Walter Shapp. Any comments? Well, I think we're going to find out tonight. I mean, this is a marvelous case for a historian type. I mean, also as a fan and as a musician, to find out all these intersections between all of us in this room. Because I'll tell you, there's no one sitting in this room tonight whose story clearly doesn't intersect with this jazz story. Because that's why we're all here tonight. And they say 6 degrees of separation, but I think in jazz it's about 1 degree. And tonight there's no degrees because it's Benny Carter, and that's the marvelous part of it. I'd like to focus over here as we work our way towards the folks who play with Benny. Gene, I was wondering if I could just get a memory of your first encounter with Mr. Carter.
Well, I was a fan of his for a long while before I met him, but in the meantime, I met my first husband, Shorty Chirac, and we had to step on it because they were leaving town, and we got to know each other very well. I went to listen to his records, he listened to mine, and we had all the same Benny Carters. I thought, my God, I can't let this go. So we got married. And the other end of the story is that after Shorty died, my subsequent husband, Bob Bach, gave me a present, and it was a picture of, well, it was a LP, big picture, and there were 4 musicians on the front of it, and there was Barney Bigard, and I think it was Ben Webster, wasn't it? Yes. And Benny Carter and Shorty Chirac, and they're all looking kind of serious, and Shorty's looking like, ooh, I've gone to heaven. It's so cute. In the interval, I did get to meet Benny and know him through Leonard Feather, whose first recording that he produced in London was Benny Carter, with the vocal by, oh God, listen, names fly out the window.
Elizabeth Welch.
Thank you, Elizabeth Welch. Leonard and Benny both tell the story that he was up in some agent's office, this is Benny, discussing the recording, and he said, we have to have a vocal on this, and Benny looked up on the wall and saw the photograph of somebody who was a neighbor of his when they were kids in San Juan Hill, and he said, oh, I know her, let's get her. Oh, she's not a singer, she's a distinguished actress. Well, she was indeed all of that in London with a British accent and very grand, but she sang When Lights Are Low on the recording. And so anyway, I was thrilled when I finally did get to meet him, and Hilma, and came to their house a lot in California. And one luncheon, one day, Virginia Wicks and Hilma and I were the 3 people with Benny. And he looked around the room and he said, I'm the luckiest man in the world. Now, none of us are kids. I mean, I could tell you I'm 86 and Virginia's pushing, and I know that Hilma's not a debutante. She looks it, but she's faking it. But and he said, I'm the luckiest man in the world. He said, I'm having lunch with 3 gorgeous women.
Thank you, Gene. That was wonderful. By the way, I was acknowledging folks who were in the audience before, and one more I want to mention. We have the daughter of one of Benny's oldest friends, one of the greatest musicians of the world, Roy Eldridge's daughter. And I'm sorry, the first name is Carol Eldridge. Talk about loyalty. Thank you so much. As we move here, we'd like to talk to our musicians panel here and ask them 2 questions: when they first became aware of Benny Carter, and then when they first actually got to hear him in person and eventually make music with him. And we'll start with Joe Wilder.
I don't really remember exactly where.
I can take the mic.
It was here in New York, though. I saw him at the time, if I'm not mistaken, I think Billy Kyle was playing piano with him. I'm saying that just to find out if someone can remember at what point he was with it. But I know it was a great band. I remember that. And I had been made aware of Benny when I was a little boy. I was playing cornet. My father had bought a cornet for me, and I was taking cornet lessons. And we had a radio, and we used to hear all the different bands, and he heard Benny, and he said to me, there's a fellow who plays the saxophone as well as he plays the trumpet and plays everything else, and he was talking about how great Benny was. So I remember that. Of course, I was so young that I knew about the talent, but I wasn't aware of how great he really was until many, many years later when I got to meet Benny. And I'm going to tell one story. I was in Philadelphia visiting my father, and we were talking about something. My father was a good friend of Don Redman, and he was talking about how difficult it was for the talented musicians, black or white, but in particular black musicians who were living in Harlem to get work. And in talking about it, he mentioned something about having played a benefit for Chick Webb with Mercer Ellington's band. And he always talked about the fact that they never got paid. And then he said something about Benny Carter. And I said, oh, you know, I recently did a record with Benny Carter. And I kept on talking. My father said, wait a minute. You know Benny Carter? I said, yeah, Benny and I are friends. You're a friend of Benny Carter? And you could see my stock going up on the side.
Joe, I'd just like to follow up with one question, because when we heard that recording of the Black Bottom at the beginning, and Benny played the trumpet on it, and while the record was playing, of course, our musicians panel knew right away the trick we were playing on y'all, which was to tell you that Benny played all these instruments. And Joe mentioned right away the famous Benny Carter record of I Surrender Dear, Capitol Records. These are things that musicians just all know and all just talk about. And I'm wondering if you could just address from a Benny Carter, the trumpeter, and how that impressed you.
Yeah, well, I was really impressed by that. As a matter of fact, I always felt that when Harry James played ballads in the beginning, that he was somewhat influenced. He might not have been, but I think he was, basically, because oddly enough, Benny played that style of ballads when he was playing, and he wasn't imitating Louis or anything. It was completely different. It was Benny Carter, and I think he got a lot of other trumpet players thinking melodically like the way he played was crazy.
Yeah. And he had a great range.
Oh, he had
played
tremendous
high.
range. He had tremendous range. He was kind of home on the range.
Somebody's going to come up about a gig that Benny Carter did in Buffalo. I'm sure that'll be coming. And in Rome, and then we'll be straight. Ed, I was wondering if you could just take the mic for a moment and fill in a little bit of the history about the man that Benny Carter's named for, and about the connection with trumpet in early Benny Carter history.
Well, Benny was first attracted to the trumpet. That was his first instrument. And, as a teenager, he saved, I think he worked in a laundry, he said, and he worked for 30 weeks and he put down $1 a week to save enough money to buy a trumpet. And then he took it home and expected to be able to sound like Bubba Miley, his neighbor, over the weekend. And when he discovered he couldn't play like Bubba Miley in 3 days, he went back to the store and they swapped it for a C melody saxophone, which somebody told him would be easier, which he said he subsequently found out was not easier, but it was different. So, but he always loved the sound of the trumpet, and I think he used to say that the saxophone leads the alto leads the sax section, but the trumpet leads the band. So he eventually returned to the trumpet with the encouragement of Doc Cheatham, who played with him in McKinney's Cotton Pickers and in Benny's early orchestra. And Doc, of course, had played saxophone also, had doubled, and he assured Benny that it wouldn't adversely affect his embouchure. And he used to pass the trumpet down from the bandstand to Benny, who was leading the band, and tell him to solo, so he learned on the job, sort of. And also his cousin, Cuban Bennett, Benny's cousin, Benny's middle name is Bennett, and that's the Bennett from that family, side of the family, was a great legendary figure, a trumpet player who never recorded, one of these people that you always hear spoken about, but there's no documentation of them. And Roy Eldridge was one that sung his praises. All the trumpet players said he was thinking very harmonically back in the 20s. And Benny sort of described his style as what Dizzy Gillespie evolved into, only he was doing it, at a much earlier stage, and was a role model for Benny. So that's how. And then he continued to play the trumpet on and off throughout his whole career. Sometimes he would, lay off it for almost a decade, but he always came back to it, and including his last decade. He played trumpet a few times right up until the early 90s.
I remember once when I was out visiting Benny and Hilma back in his music room, and he had a piece of sheet music on the piano with Mona Lisa. and he was looking at for some reason. He asked me if I would just play the chords on the piano. He picked up a trumpet, which was just lying on the piano, and just picked up and played with no warming up, which musicians will tell you was like impossible. Picked up the trumpet and played this gorgeous solo on it, just like that. Hilma, did you want to add something?
Oh, no, I was thinking of an anecdote. Once when we were in the south of France at Joe Whedon's festival, and we had been invited to lunch with Benny Goodman's brother. I don't remember his first name, Harry. And then we came back to the festival, and we're sitting there, and Harry Goodman is buying a champagne at the bar, and two elderly Swiss clarinetists came by, and they said, "Benny Carter, why did you ever stop playing the clarinet? You were so much better than Benny Goodman."
Rough one. I'll give you a little historical tidbit here about Benny Carter. One of the amazing things about Benny Carter that few people know, except when I read it in Ed's book many years ago, and I found out from Benny Goodman himself later, was that before Fletcher Henderson, when Benny Goodman had his initial success on the Let's Dance radio show, before Fletcher Henderson, do you know who wrote his whole library? Benny Carter. Benny Carter wrote the first Benny Goodman book, and they made recordings of Take My Word and a couple of other charts. So I mean, Benny Carter just, I think it was Charlie Barnett once who said that, there's no great band that doesn't have Benny Carter arrangements in it. And Benny did so many things for people behind the scenes. So many young band leaders back in the swing era would need music. Benny would be very generous with giving orchestrations, and I can tell you that 30, 40 years later, in the early 80s, when I was putting my band together, Benny laid a whole bunch of his library on me and said, you can use it and you can play it. And I think that's just a representative anecdote of what he did for me. He did for so many people. There's so much to be told about Benny. Speaking of which, let's migrate over to Mr. Joe Gales, who plays the same instrument as Benny, the saxophone. Thoughts about Benny?
First time I heard of, I'm from the West, from Colorado, from Denver. And we had, at that time, with the young guys, I heard you say 1938, that was the time I picked the horn up. So there was an old musician there named George Morrison. I don't know if anybody knows him. And the vocalist was Hattie McDaniels. Also, Andy Kirk was there. So we'd go by and listen to Andy Kirk and rehearse, and they would have Benny Carter's records on. And that's how, the first time, I couldn't believe it, that the band would play the trumpet and the saxophone, because you got two different types of armatures, and that's a hard thing to do. Next time I was in the Army, and I had a guy, our piano player at that time was Leonard, was Earl Garner's brother, Linton. Now Linton, I hate to say this, to me was a better musician than Earl, because he could do everything. But he would listen to he would listen to Benny Carter at the same time writing, on the sheet. I couldn't believe this, but he was getting some of the ideas. And by being with Dizzy, Jimmy will tell you this, we had chord extensions. And I mean, instead of these triads of C, E, G, I mean, we had some chords this long. And Benny Carter was doing the same thing, but only it just wasn't illustrated. But anyhow, now Fletcher Henderson was another writer. Then we began to like Cy Oliver. Now Cy Oliver was we call him two-beat writer. Now Cy was with a band called Jimmy Lunsford. Now Jimmy Lunsford was very musical. His band, I don't know if they came, I don't know, Fisk or someplace down there.
Jimmy was from Denver.
Huh?
Jimmy
I was
Lofton
gonna
was from
say,
Denver, yeah.
and he was from Denver too. So we were surrounded. But we couldn't, at that time, we couldn't go hear these guys because where they played, as you say, they wouldn't let us in, you see. So we'd have to wait until they came to a place in Denver called Five Points. Now in Five Points, everybody was there. All bands, or whenever they came, we would jam, as they called it. So one day Benny Carter came in and nobody was playing but Benny. Everybody was just listening to Benny Carter. And to me, that was just a tribute to this man. Next thing I know, when we went in the Army, as I was saying with Litton Garner, then when I came out, I joined Dizzy. And I never knew that Dizzy knew about Benny Carter. And you see, he told us what to do. And if you listen to these records, you will hear it. And that's how we developed the style and listened to Benny Carter. But I never met Benny to sit down to talk to him. That much I regret. Okay?
I was wondering if someone could tell another story and another side of Benny Carter's life, which was, and this was kind of touched upon by the anecdote that Joe was just telling. Benny had quite a few intersections, of course, with the civil rights movement as someone who actually did some historic things out in Los Angeles with the Union and also with the area in which he lived. And Joyce, I wonder if you could tell us about that? Or?
I can't tell you too much because at the time I lived here.
Sure.
And Dad was in Los Angeles. But I'm particularly proud of his work with the union. There was a white union and a black union. And Dad led the fight to combine the two. And I just thought that was the greatest thing because when you think about it, he had a lot to lose.
Yes, he did.
But he was willing to fight the good fight.
Ed, or who am I wondering if a little more implication about when Benny moved out to that area where he had a whole big to-do with actually trying to buy a house, I believe.
You probably know more about it.
Well, actually, it's funny you should mention that because just a few months ago when I was visiting Hilma in Los Angeles, she came up, she's been going through Benny's files and we've been getting things for the Institute of Jazz Studies archives. And
Ed, I'm going to interrupt for 1 second. You know, we're videotaping these for our archives and we have to change the tape. And Museum of American History, and he said, they gave him an award. He said, I'd like to accept this award on behalf of Fletcher Henderson and Louis Armstrong, because back when I was young, they said that it took Paul Whiteman to make a lady out of jazz. He said, and he said, if Louis Armstrong and Fletcher Henderson didn't make a lady out of jazz, I don't know who did. And the place just went like that. But that was Benny. Benny could say something and do something and slip it by and make his point in such an elegant way. Okay, are we filming again? Okay. So Ed, you were going to tell the story about.
Well, I just want to add one of Benny's great cracks that he made on the spur of the moment, similar to that, when he was asked to accept an award on behalf of Fletcher Henderson. And this is a very august occasion in the American Jazz Hall of Fame, and everybody is, wearing ties and everything. And so he.
Fletcher had died many years before.
Yes, Fletcher had been dead since the 50s, so 1950, I guess. So anyway.
December 29th of 52.
All right. And in any case, so they handed Benny the plaque, and he stares at it for a minute, and he says, I'm very honored to accept this award on behalf of my friend and late band leader, Fletcher Henderson. And then he paused and said, now I have to figure out how to get it to him without hand carrying it. But what was the question?
About Benny breaking down the
Oh, right. So I was saying were sitting around the table at the house a few months ago, and Hilma had found another treasure trove of materials, including correspondence with a lawyer trying to get Benny evicted from the house that he had just purchased in 1947, was it, I think, in Hollywood, because they had the neighborhood had a covenant against any black person living there. There wasn't, or even being there, that wasn't employed as, domestic or something. And so Benny had found a way, an intricate way. A friend of his bought the house and sold it to him for $1 or something like that. And then eventually they took it to court and they won, so that, and then Benny moved out to a bigger house anyway, in a better neighborhood.
Just one side point I'll make this real quick as we talk about all these different avenues of Benny's career and his influence. Another one, which we're glancing over for a moment, is what he did in the Hollywood studios as being one of the very first African-American musicians to write music for movies and for television and major films. You'll see him playing the saxophone in Snows of Kilimanjaro with Gregory Peck. There's a great scene where Benny's playing the saxophone, but he did a lot of soundtrack work, and he broke the color line in the Hollywood studios, and he also opened the door for any number of people, including J.J. Johnson, Oliver Nelson, tried to do it for Johnny Carisi, and I was going to say, and another person who's had a slight influence on the American music scene named Quincy Jones was ushered in through the good graces of Mr. Benny Carter. So that's just another aspect of it. All right, I'm going to pass the mic over to our next gentleman, Mr. Jimmy Heath.
My father used to buy a lot of records, and he had a record of Benny Carter when I was 13 maybe, or 14, and it was Cocktails for Two. And we all in my family were all given an instrument of our choice, and I had heard Benny and Johnny Hodges in my house with my father playing the records. So when Pop asked me, say, Jimmy, what do you want to play? I said, I want to play an alto saxophone. So he bought this alto saxophone for me for $90. It took him about a year paying $3 or $4 a week. And anyway, I followed Benny Carter's career as a arranger, saxophonist, and composer over the years. And then I was fortunate enough that he asked me to be on a recording of saxophones that he was making. It had Herb Geller and Frank West, Joe Temperley, Richard Wines, Milt Hinton, and Ronnie Bedford on the drums. I remember what he told him to. But it was I thought I was in heaven. I had gone all the way from hearing this man when I was a kid to performing with him on a recording. And right now, I listen to that record with deep admiration for his arranging skills beside his playing. As a composer and arranger myself, I always, and a teacher at Queens College, I would always tell my composition students, I said, when it comes to writing a saxophone solo, or you've got to listen to Benny Carter, because Benny Carter would make everybody's part sound good. There's a way that most people write saxophone solos who don't really know. And the lead alto player would have a nice line. He's moving pretty. And the baritone sax would have a nice line. He's pretty. And the inner lines would be playing double notes. And he's saying, and the inner line said, we got this corny parts in the middle. But Benny had a way of, what he told me it was, I said, well, he said, I cross voice. If the second tenor and the fourth tenor have two notes the same, I would give switch notes. So if this one said boo bee boo bee, and another one said bee boo bee boo, it would be a better line to play than a double noted line. So he's one of the greatest soli writers of all time. On this record I made, it's on Music Masters. We play one of Quincy Jones' tunes from The Pawnbroker, and the theme up from The Pawnbroker. And when I play that, I still get chills. And the other thing about Mr. Benny Carter was that the giant of a musician that he was, he would call me on the phone, you know, and talk sometimes. I say, well, Benny, I was going to call you. And he says, oh, that's okay. And he would call me and talk. I was also very fortunate that he asked me to play when he received the Kennedy Center honors. And that was televised. And I think the recording that we did was televised. It was not televised, but videoed. It's part of that video on Benny Carter. The people came in the studio and made a copy. So I'm in his video. I played with him. He would call me on the phone. I loved him. He's a great musician, one of the greatest of all time.
Well, next I'll pass the mic over to young blood here on the sofa. Somebody who's known not only for his great drumming, but he's been on the radio for a long time. And I can tell you, somebody who's been on at least 2 different radio stations and networks with this guy. And you can't say this about many people whose careers impinge in commercial radio. This is a gentleman with a kind of integrity. I'll be very vague and general about this, but we were involved in a big, what I would say, a big commercial kind of product that impinged upon jazz. And when the management went left and decided to leave the pure jazz alone, if you don't mind me saying this, Kenny quit. And it's one of the most integrity-full moments in this commercial music world that I've ever seen. Besides being an outstanding drummer, he also has done a lot to influence a lot of stuff. Kenny.
I think Loren and I, we perhaps the youngest guys to record with Benny. But I first met Benny and Helma in Europe. It must have been, it was in Sweden or somewhere. Finland, that's right. It was in Finland. And I knew about Benny as a kid from the records, Further Definitions or the Impulse recordings. But then what knocked me out was the Capitol records. Because they had there was a blue covered Capitol LP that I bought for about $2.99. It was one of the Dutch Capitol records, and it had I Surrender Dear and I Can't Escape From You. That saxophone solo on there is unbelievable. I just sit there and put the record on and listen to it. Just that saxophone, it would lift it up. I remember the first record I had, it got worn out just from listening to the saxophone. So I couldn't believe anybody could write like that for sax. It's just like Mr. Heath said. But when I met him in Finland along with Helma, and there was a jam session. I was just over there just playing with different people, and I had met Benny. And we had dinner a few times, and I remember playing a jam session. I remember J.J. Johnson. It was J.J. Johnson, and there was a few other musicians. So that's how we first got a chance to play together. And of course, I was knocked out by playing with Benny Carter, because that's somebody that I looked up to as a kid, growing up. So anyway, when I got back to New York, well, of course I was excited about it. I said, wow, man, I got a chance to play with Benny Carter. Didn't give it any more thought after that. I said, well, maybe one day I play with him again. All of a sudden, I get a call from Ed. I think you called me, on behalf of Benny. And next thing I know, I was playing at the Armory. Remember that Armory gig? That was the first time I played with him, after that. Then every time he would come to New York to work at that joint, Carlos One, a lot of times he would call me to do those gigs. When he'd come to New York City, he would call me to play. So I got a chance to hang out with him, but you know, as a man, if I could be half the man that Benny Carter was, I'd be doing good. Because I used to just sit around and watch him. The things that he would do, the way he would talk to people was unbelievable. And of course, I'd be doing good if I could look good at half of his age. That's the other thing. He had his mind about him and everything. You couldn't put anything past Mr. Carter. He was sharp, man, sharp as a tack. But anyway, so well, Benny helped me out, man. I mean, he really helped me out. Because, you know, I got married, and my friend, I think I told this story one time, but I'll tell you again, man. I got married, and man, I got ready to go through a divorce, and it was a nasty divorce. I mean, nasty with 3 E's on the end. You didn't knock out for a while. Oh, man, I mean, it was really bad, man. I mean, you know, and I was trying to do the right thing, you know, but she wanted to be a real doot-da-doo. So anyway, somehow or another, they was doing that recording, the Central City Sketches. And I heard about this recording session. Now, I'd been working with Benny. Anyway, but I knew he was back in town. So I would go to see him, see how he was doing. Meanwhile, in the middle of all this mess that I was going to court and all kinds of stuff. So anyway, I went up there to see him. And so he's talking to some people, so I walk in. It was during the break. So walk in, and I'm standing over on the side. And he's talking to these people, and he sees me. And he must have told these people, oh, excuse me. And he walks over to me, and he gives me a big hug. And he says, young man, I've heard all you've been going through. Now, I don't know how he found out about it. I think Mel Lewis, because Mel and I were close, and Mel knew, you know, and I think Benny must have asked about me. But somehow or another he found it. That Mel must have told him. He said, well, he must have told him. So when he saw me, he says, young man, I heard all you've been going through. He said, man, but don't let it bother you. He said, look, man, I had to go through a couple of times myself. He said something that I never forget. He says, look, man, it ain't nothing but cheap dollars. And I didn't know what he was saying. He says, it ain't nothing but cheap dollars, man. And so then he goes on and he says, so we're talking, he says, look, man, give her what she wants. Just give it to her, man. Give her what she wants. And so then he says, look, man, you got a good name in the business. You keep your nose clean. This is just a minor setback for you. You're going to be all right, man. I wouldn't even worry about it. And so then he says, man, that's when he said, look, man, I had to go through that myself. And look, I mean, I'm still here. And so then I said, well, man, now that you mention it, what's your secret, man? I mean, at the time, he was in his 70s, I guess. I said, baby, you look like you're in your 50s, man. What's your secret? He said, well, I'm telling you, man. It ain't no secret. I'm telling you. He said, look, give her what she wants and don't keep this, so I'll never forget it as long as I live. He says, don't keep no hate in your heart. That'll kill you quicker than cancer. I never will forget that, man. You know, and then, so he says, oh, man, you'll be all right. Don't worry about it. Nothing but cheap dollars. So a few months later, you know, he was working at Carlos One. So they called me for the gig, but I couldn't make it because I was working the Vanguard with Tommy Flanagan. So I came by to see him anyway. And so it was at that dressing room upstairs. So I went upstairs, you know, so everything had worked out for me. So he sees me in the reflection in the mirror. He's sitting right there, you know, in the dressing room. So he sees me and he says, hey, man, how'd it work out? Worked out all right, didn't it? And I said, well, yeah. See, man, I told you, man. I told you. And then so then I thanked him for it. But this was a real man. I mean, the way he would conduct himself. One time I was doing a concert at Lincoln Center with him. It was with, he wrote this big extended composition called Good Vibes. It featured Bobby Hutcherson and Milt Jackson. So this is in the early days of Lincoln Center, when Lincoln Center was really happening. I mean, it's some unbelievable concerts. So anyway, so I get hired to play, this concert. So the first rehearsal, Benny, man, always waited to the last minute. I mean, he was writing just to the very day of the concert, man. I mean, and see, so the first day, the rehearsal was canceled because the music wasn't ready. Okay, so then the next day, they had, I guess he must have had the copyists, they got the music together, so they brought the stuff in. So drum parts, very few people know how to really write drum parts. So now we got about 2 days before concert. So here walks Benny. So he comes in. We had 2 rehearsals. We had 2 rehearsals. And so in walks Benny with the music. Hey, King, how you doing, man? So we talk. So he passes music out. So he puts a drum part. And there's nothing in it but quarter notes, just slashes across the thing. So he starts out, and the band, all this, man. And there's nothing for me to play. I never played this before. I mean, there's nothing notated, nothing, 0. So I said, oh God, man, this concert's in a couple of days. What am I gonna? So I had the tape recorder. Now you remember this, man. So I had a tape recorder, right? So I said, the only way I'm gonna learn this is I have to record this stuff and go back home and rewrite parts. It's the only way, man. There's no way another. I don't have a lot of time to be fooling around with this stuff, man. So Benny didn't say nothing, so I set the tape recorder, just a little Walkman, set the thing up there. So we're rehearsing. So we rehearsed through all the stuff. So, okay, rehearsal's over. So I go home, right? Man, I'm scraping my backside off, man. I sit up and I'm doing all this stuff, writing all these parts. The next morning was rehearsal. So now we thought it was going to be in a certain rehearsal room, but it turned out to be in another one. So somebody came and says, well, Benny's over across the street at this other rehearsal spot, and he's over there waiting for you. Well, we were all over there. Milt Jackson, Bobby Hutcherson, all these people in the band. So all right, we walk over to the other side, to this other rehearsal place, it was in another part of Lincoln Center. So we walk across the street. We get there, and so I'm the first to walk in, and Benny is there. He's waiting for us. So I said, hey, King, how you feeling this morning? He says, I'm doing fine, and I would appreciate it if you wouldn't tape any more of my concerts and my rehearsals. This is not for your archives. And Milt Jackson and Bobby Hutcherson were behind me. All the musicians were behind me. It was like a fallout shelter, man. Everybody looked around, nobody around, man. Because Benny, don't get him mad. He'll knock you out. So I got scared, man. So I said, well, Benny, you don't understand, man. I mean, I had to rewrite these parts. I said, Benny, you don't understand. What do you mean I don't understand? I said, man, there's nothing on these parts but slashes. There's no notation of anything. What do you mean? I write. He said, what do you mean? I pay my copyists good money to write these parts. I said, Benny, you don't understand. Let me show you what's happening. So he puts his glasses on, and so then I said, here are your parts. Here are my parts. I stayed up all night rewriting these parts. So he took his glasses off. He says, you stayed up all night rewriting this? I said, yeah. He said, well, bless your heart. So now, all right, we get on the bandstand to see, man, Benny Carter, very foxy, man. I mean, that's one of the smartest men I ever met in my life, right? He picked the hardest part of the thing to do. The hardest movement, which was like the last movement, was up here, and all this stuff, man. And so then he counts it off. Milt Jackson, Bobby Hutcherson, he counts it off. So, man, I played it the best. I nailed it. It was bam, bam. The thing finishes, and this is what I'm talking about, a real man. Because there's a lot of people in this business, a lot of them are gone now, a lot of them are real idiots, man. Where they treated the side man like you know what, But he's a real man, because when it was over, in front of everybody, he said, man, you know what, Wash? You can tape these rehearsals anytime you want, man. This is what you done. He says, I'm sorry for yelling at you in front of everybody, in front of everybody. I know some people that wouldn't do that. I know some band leaders that would just play it on off, man, you know. So that's a real man for you. That really knocked me out. But the last story, the last quick thing is that I wanted to say was this guy. I set up there. You've seen him do this too. You've seen him do this too, Ed. I was been talking to him one time. I think he did it to you one time. I was sitting there talking with him. And it was at a record date or something we was doing. And he's sitting up there. I hadn't seen him in a while. So he's sitting up there writing these parts, right? And see, you know, guys like that, they don't write with the piano in mind. They write parts. They don't write from the score. They can sit there and write parts. Part like the first alto, third alto, tenor, baritone, and they write them out just like that. No, they don't have to go to the piano, you know. See, they sit up there and think of it, and they can just write this stuff out there, man. So I'm standing up there, and Benny's rewriting something. Something was wrong. He's rewriting these parts, and so he said, "So how you been, man?" I said, "I'm doing fine." And so then he asked me some other question. And I said, it was yes. I said, yeah. And then he asked me something, I said, no. So then he said, man, you don't want to talk to me? I said, look, Benny, you're writing music, man. I'm trying not to bother you. And he said something like, oh, nonsense. And so how's such and such doing? So he's doing fine. You know, man, I saw him the other day. You know, he was out in Los Angeles. Listen, I'm telling you, you've seen him do this, haven't you, Ed? And he's writing, man. Well, you know what? I was going to tell him that, and he's writing. And they put that stuff up there and played it. There was no perfect. There were no mistakes, man. Look, if I'm copying a part to part, and I have a radio or a television on, you can bet there's going to be 3 bars that are the same. It's going to be messed up. But this guy's sitting up there talking to me, writing parts, not going to the piano, just writing parts. And I said, oh man, unbelievable. But I'm honored to have made. I make 2 records, I think I made either 2 or 3 records. I'm honored to have made 2 records with Benny Carter, and I was proud to know the man. I mean, he was a real man, and you don't get a chance in this business to meet too many people like that.
That's one. Thanks, Kenny. One thing that just struck me about Benny Carter was when you mentioned that was his ability to, like you were saying, write music while do all this other stuff, and he wrote all this great music for films. And I was wondering if you could just real quick maybe just recap Benny's film career, just a little bit about some of the films he wrote for him, just an overview of that stuff.
Okay, well, basically, he actually wrote for a film while he was in London, something called OK for Sound. He did a little bit on the soundtrack there, including writing the parts for strings, which I think was the first time he had done that. But then he really got into it in earnest on for the soundtrack of Stormy Weather in 1943 when he was in Los Angeles with his band. And somehow he got hooked up with Alfred Newman, the famous musical director, who hired him to write part of the score for Stormy Weather, and he also played on the soundtrack. And Alfred Newman, part of it involved string writing also, and Alfred Newman, who of course has credits, a mile long, said it was some of the most innovative string writing he had seen for, film work. And from there he went on to do, he just became part of the stable at Universal Films and then later television. And he worked on dozens and dozens of television shows, and he only really got his name as a musical director on one major film, that was Buck and the Preacher. But he did a lot of so-called ghostwriting, which he never viewed as a derogatory term. he felt it was, many people did it, and it was well paid, and, you know, although he didn't get screen credit. But he wrote for, he was proud of the fact that he didn't want to be labeled a jazz, so-called jazz composer, that he could write for any kind of dramatic thing, and a lot of his scores were a straight dramatic series, like he was a regular writer for Chrysler Theater, which has some very impressive musical backgrounds.
You know, I was flicking the channels, this is about maybe 10 years ago on an afternoon, and not that I would watch a show called The Munsters, but it just happened to go by as I was flicking the channels, and I don't know what happened, the flicker got broken or something, and my friend Flicka. So I'm sitting there, and next thing you know, like, there's The Munsters, and I think it was one of those typically intellectual Munster episodes, where Herman Munster's daughter was at her high school graduation, and she didn't want her father to come because he looked like Herman Munster. And he came anyway, and he's dancing, and ho, 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 and he's dancing, and she's dying, and the band is playing a Benny Carter tune. I couldn't believe this. I'm hearing da 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 dee dee dee. This tune called Lydia, also called The Kids From You. So I picked up the phone and I called Benny right out in California. I said, Benny, I said, you should get your lawyer or somebody, because this show from 1966, they stole one of your tunes. And he says, what do you mean stole it? He says, I wrote a lot of music for Universal, and it was called Work for Hire, and they would just write, you know, dozens of tunes and give it to the film studio, and it could wind up on the Munsters or could wind up anywhere. And I'm sure he got a nice royalty check, I assume.
That was actually the tape that Kenny Washington made at the rehearsal.
You know, that's another side of Benny, which just reminded me. I saw him do this when I was a customer in clubs. It didn't happen when I worked with him. It was mostly just recording dates or a few big band things. But he was brave in the sense of, with all his manners and all his gentleness of just seeming so elevated, so classy all the time. He would not suffer things gladly, and when someone was recording in an audience, he would actually take the step that so many of us musicians always wanted to do, but never had just didn't have the strength to do. Tell someone, turn that machine off, or turn that tape machine off, and he did a lot of things like that also. Ed, you were going to say something? Oh, I'm sorry, Jimmy.
Ed, am I wrong in the fact that Benny Carter had Max Roach and Miles Davis in the band? Were they in the JJ? Were they in at what time?
Not at the same time.
No, but Max
44.
Max was in 44?
Right.
43, 44, and 45.
And was JJ in at the thing?
Yeah, JJ's
Right, so I did see that. I thought I was having illusions. I saw him at the Earl Theater in Philadelphia, the Benny Carter band, when Max Roach was in the band.
He also had other innovators. Art Pepper was in the band. George Russell was in his band playing drums at one point. You know, a whole host of
Also,
other,
you know, the among the many treasures that when we went out to LA to help put the music in order for a concert that Benny was doing at Jazz Lincoln Center, among the music that Benny had in his garage, one was, this is amazing, he had one black folder there, and I opened it up, and it was the original library of the John Kirby Sextet. I mean, the original music and handwriting, you know, from Charlie Shavers, and I said, what's this doing here? And he said that when John Kirby came out to the West Coast in his last days in 1950, and he was drinking a lot, and Benny tried to help him, and I guess he was living with Benny, and so his effects just stayed there because that's where he passed. And the other thing was, this is more of an esoteric name, but for jazz writers, there's a guy named Bob Grettinger, who wrote for the Stan Kenton Band. He wrote something called City of Gas. I'm sorry, City of Glass. Sorry. It was kind of like, it was kind of esoteric writing, and Benny had this folder, and there was like this buried treasure of Bob Grettinger played saxophone in Benny Carter's band, and he wrote a whole bunch of music, and we actually recorded one of them called Iguana on a record at one point. So I mean his the things, and also just one last point about the museum. Benny helped the Jazz Museum in Harlem. I just want to put that on record. The last time I went out to visit was I guess the winter before he passed, and we needed some help in Hollywood and needed some help getting to a few places, and and he went right to work and helped us, so I knew that he was behind what we were doing, which was very, very important also. I'd like to open up the audience. Actually, we have another person over here who we've heard from as he fitfully gave us dates and facts from the audience there, but we're talking about the one and only Phil Schaap. And Phil, I was going to share a brief thought about that.
Well, I'll combine two thoughts about Benny Carter, which is the fact that he was better than all of us at anything that we did, and that he was so nice about that. And I recall, and I know that Ed Berger lived this many, many times over in later years, but when Benny Carter played the West End, we have on the radio station WKCR, which is across the street from the West End, a Wednesday evening show where the musician plays DJ. And I must have caught him in a soft moment because he really didn't want to do it. And he nevertheless came across the street and turned into a disc jockey. He, in fact, insisted on calling himself a disc jockey and not an on-air host. And he figured out every way to look perfectly right and make us look perfectly wrong as he announced things. He didn't want to do it the right way, and he knew how to do it seamlessly. He had figured out, like he'd been doing disc jockey, and then one mic break, he kind of looked at it and gave it a little smile. And that one, he said, this is Jazz Alternatives. I'm your host, Benny Carter, and this is the ID perfectly, and the personnel, and he even, I'm sure, did a little imitation of me just to add in to gild the lily. He was, he could, you know, in the sports they have this thing when somebody is so great that he can take his'n and beat your'n, or take your'n and beat his'n. And that's what Benny Carter, he did everything, including what you do, better than anybody. And it's my most lasting impression is he was the king, he was perfect. And I don't really have too much else to say. We have so many wonderful people here.
Okay then.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Phil. Phil mentioned it, and Kenny mentioned it. I just want to amplify a little bit. Why do people call Benny Carter the king? Because going back to King Oliver and way before, that was like an honorary title among musicians to call the very few people who had that moniker. And Benny Carter was one who was always called the king because he was the king. We were joined after we started by a musician who just came from a record date, so we're glad that you made it at all, who heads all the music over at the Schoenberg Center, played with all these great musicians over the years, Mr. Larry Ridley. One of the great spokesmen of the jazz. You'd like to add something, I think.
Sorry I was late, but I'm glad I was working. I think everything that I heard Kenny say came in on the end of tail end of Jimmy Heath's comments, and I have to just further amplify everything that was said. He was, and when you mentioned about him being the king, he was royalty personified, you know. And I had the pleasure of playing with him on several occasions. And Helma, it's good to see you. I haven't seen you in a while. Yeah, and we did what was that date that we did, and it's still recorded. It was with Dizzy and
at Princeton.
At Princeton, right? We
Dizzy and Joe Kennedy.
Right, Joe Kennedy was in. I played bass. Yeah, it was great. I mean, I had the opportunity to play with him several times, and it was always just fantastic because he was such a gracious human being, and you know the idea that was mentioned about he didn't like to be pigeonholed in terms of, or categorized in terms of things, because he was a musician. You know, he was just a great musician. So it wasn't, even though we know that he was one of the giants of this music that we call jazz, you know, but his talent was just, so as a band leader, he was fantastic, and he shared so many stories because he knew that I was from Indianapolis, and J.J. Johnson and I, you know, very close, we're very close. And he used to share stories with me about Jay and when Jay was in the band, and Jay always spoke very fondly of his experiences working with Benny. And I'm just glad I had an opportunity to perform with him and to record. I'm waiting on that record to come out.
We have a lot of rights issues to work out.
Yeah. Okay, well, I mean, like I say, all I can do is just co-sign 200% everything that's been said. I mean, because he was just a fantastic, and his wife is just a wonderful, gracious, wonderful lady.
No, I just remembered an incident that it's when we were in the place called Noordwijk, Holland, where they had the jazz parties, and they would hire 4 or 5 saxophone players, 4 or 5 trumpet players, 4 or 5 of each instrument, and put groups together. And then Benny was one of the special guests this particular year. And Slide Hampton had written an arrangement on Body and Soul. And there was a couple of things that Benny didn't like musically. Slide had changed the harmony to what Coltrane had played. And that's a different harmonization of the song. And so if you can't play the melody on it, Benny didn't like it. And when Drain played his solo, he would go away from the melody, and he wouldn't use that. So Benny asked me, he says, Heath, is he gonna, I say, no, when you come in, he's gonna play the straight chords to Body and Soul, because Benny didn't want to. He says, no, what's he doing to the song? The other thing was, he didn't like quips. He didn't like you to play one song. Why is he playing that in this? You remember that, folks? He didn't like that. If you were playing Perdido, why would you play Honeysuckle Rose in it? Because it's the same chord structure a little bit. He didn't like that. You know, it's a difference. You know, and God rest the dead. It's so different with Dizzy and his wife who just passed, Lorraine. Dizzy told me, Lorraine asked him, say, hey man, why don't you put them songs in there like Bird does? And Dizzy started putting quotes in because Lorraine told him that Charlie Parker did it. Because everybody here, you play another song and then they relate to that. But Benny did not like that. If you're playing this song, play this song.
And don't play When Lights Are Low wrong with long bridge. Oh man, it's over. Right?
We were on a record day. You know, Benny actually stopped. A great pianist friend of ours. We were making a record of one of his tunes, and he stopped the take. He stopped it because the piano player quoted "Take the A Train," and anyway, he stopped and he said, I wouldn't say his name, but he said, Joe, he said, you can do better than that. He said, and he actually stopped it. He actually stopped it. And but actually, I'd like to just to flip it back over to Hilma Formal. Here's another side of Benny Carter that you may not have known. What's the word? Etymologist or something like that. Someone who studies words. Benny and Hilma, for those who were blessed enough to be friends with them, know that if you want to, like, you know, some people talk about recipes and some people talk about clothes. Talk about words. And what the specific meaning of a word, and if you use the word incorrectly in a sentence, I mean, it would never stop you, but if you wanted to find out exactly what that word meant, I mean, this is like a crossword puzzle haven. Actually, crossword puzzles is different. And I remember once Benny was playing down at Carlos One, and they were rehearsing. I was at a rehearsal. I wasn't playing, but I was playing. And they played All of Me. And the piano player's playing, and they go, you took the part that once was my heart, so why not? He goes, no, he goes, why not? You know, it has to be F minor major 7. And if it wasn't that chord, then he would stop it because that's the chord that made all of me, all of me. And without that A flat chord, well, then it's not all of me quite, it's something else. And Hilma, I was wondering if you could talk about the same care that Benny had about words.
Yes, well, our livre de chevet was a dictionary. We both had one. Mine was bigger than his. And we would constantly be looking up words and wanting to know exactly what the difference was between words that seemed so similar. You know, this went on forever and forever. And I would always be very amused, you know, having a master's degree from an Ivy League university. Many times Benny corrected my pronunciation. And I said, yes, but remember that I was a Spanish major.
What were some words?
Oh, I don't remember. Do you remember any specific words?
One thing that happened, I would send him practically everything I wrote, even if it was not about him, because he was a great editor. And we used to send him the Annual Review of Jazz Studies, which is a very hefty scholarly tome that we put out at the Institute of Jazz Studies. It's practically unfathomable to even us. And,
Wait a minute.
and so, we'd send Benny a copy, and about 3 or 4 days later, I'd get a phone call, and they'd say, on page 332, the fourth line down, how do you spell, and he'd come up with some crazy word, that was in there, and I said, I don't know, or, and of course I'd look it up, and he said, I think it's misspelled, And so we started sending him the galleys before we printed it. But one time I was on the phone with him, and I happened to be reading something, and if I came across a word that I thought he might be interested in, or I was confused by, I would say, have you ever heard of blah, blah, blah? And so I said, I just ran across a word that I must have looked up at least 8 times every time I see it. And it was the word picaresque. And I never could remember what it meant, so I thought he might be interested. So I said, you know the word picaresque? So he paused for a minute and he says, as in roguish? And that was the #1 definition in the dictionary. And you get right on the top of his head. Anyway.
I just want to, from a perspective of a jazz fan, jazz writer, but mainly a fan. First of all, I want to say that it was Kenny Washington who introduced me. I'm from Staten Island. I'm from Brooklyn originally, but Staten Island, and met Kenny there. And it was Kenny who introduced me to Benny Carter as a man, because that same story that he told you all, he told me that over a decade ago, and other things too. So I know the wisdom of Benny Carter. There's a couple of just quick anecdotes I want to tell. I went to see him at Carlos One back in the 80s. I think he might have been playing drums. And I had a friend with me. And in between sets, my friend says to Mr. Carter, he said, wow, you must really, been down with that bebop stuff, with Bird and Dizzy. And he's like, well, I knew, because I knew a little bit more about jazz history. And Benny Carter precedes that, laid ground for that. So, but he was kind to him. But then he asked him, well, and this is at the end of the night, he says, oh, would you like me to help you carry your saxophone? He's like, oh no, that's not necessary. So there was definitely a pride that he had, and I'd definitely like you to speak about that. And then quickly, I was reading a downbeat, and I went through a long phase of being very enamored with Phil Woods as a saxophonist, and there was a interview with Phil Woods and Downbeat. I remember them asking him about Charlie Parker, because they always talk about how Phil Woods is influenced by Charlie Parker. And he said to the writer, he said, listen, people always talk about Charlie Parker. What about Benny Carter? He's still around, and he's still doing it. He's the one they need to be talking about. And I want to ask Loren, Ed, isn't it true that Benny Carter, for a short time, played with Duke and played some of the ballads that Johnny Hodges was, that were associated with Johnny Hodges?
That's well, he did play with Duke, but only very briefly for 2 weeks in 1926. And as a sub, right, before Johnny Hodges. But I'm not sure that he was presaged Johnny Hodges' style in any way or anything, but he did sub. That was something that was always in his biography, that he played with Duke Ellington, but it was a little misleading because it was only a couple of weeks. Then many years later, he played with him on a few occasions, but never as a regular member of the orchestra. And he always was a great admirer of Johnny Hodges, and always felt Johnny Hodges did something very special and very different from what he was trying to do. So.
Didn't Duke's band make a record of Jazz Cocktail?
Yes.
So most people don't know that Duke recorded one of Benny's originals back in the 1930s, and for Duke Ellington to record the work of another jazz composer is something extraordinarily rare, because he had his own music to play, but he recorded one of Benny's pieces, which is quite unusual. Just another facet of Benny Carter's genius, which most people don't know about, is this. He made a record, okay, they mentioned before that Ben Webster was, Ben and Benny had a great relationship. I didn't know Ben Webster, I know that you guys did. But I did hear this story that, and maybe you can verify it, that Ben Webster was known for getting kind of rambunctious and out of control. And when he got out of control, supposedly he'd go berserk, and nobody could, I mean, people would clear away because his nickname was the Brute. And he would get like that. And I've heard this story, if I heard it from one musician, I've heard it from 15. This famous time when Ben was in a pool hall somewhere with a pool stick or something happened, nobody could get near him, and they said only one person you got to do, you got to call Benny Carter. So they called Benny Carter, and again, this is someone telling a story that he wasn't there for, but I've heard it enough times that it must be true. And Benny came down, and there's Ben, with a pool stick with a whole pool hall full of people like this, and Benny walked in the room, and as though he was talking to a child, he said, "Now Ben, put the pool stick down and come with me," and like a school child, Ben Webster put it down, he went like this and walked inside the corner, not with a dumb cap on, but Benny had that kind of respect, and one reason he had the respect is that if you ever shook his hand, you found out why he had that kind of respect. Benny Carter had the kind of hand, your hand would disappear in his hand. It was so broad and strong, and he was on occasions he could use those hands when he had to protect his dignity as a human being. And there's stories about that. Again, I would recommend once again this wonderful book called Benny Carter: A Life in American Music by Ed and his late father Morrow Berger. And I was mentioned Ed's brother Ken is here, and they all collaborated on this thing. And it was like a love fest. And that so the story I was telling. Ben Webster was in Benny Carter's band early on. Benny Carter made a record in 1936 in England called Nightfall. And on it, he plays a tenor saxophone solo. Benny Carter plays a tenor saxophone solo. Now, this is weird. Benny Carter sounded on tenor like Ben Webster did 3 years later. So in other words, Ben Webster's tenor style is very influenced by Benny Carter, because in 1936, Ben Webster was still on his way to finding his own personality. As a blindfold test, when you play this record for people, you say, "Who is it?" Even for musicians, they'll say, "Well, that's Ben Webster." Say, "No, it's not. That's Benny Carter." So I mean, there's just so many facets here. Joe.
I just wanted to say something. We were talking about how Benny disliked paraphrasing. He also detested backgrounds that were set up by the guys in the group. And we were out in Denver playing at the Gibson Jazz Party, and Harold Ashby thought up a little background riff. And Benny was playing, and Benny, when he got a chance to take a breath, said, "No riffs, no background." And Harold Ashby, he went right through the ceiling. Like, what is this? He got angry with Benny. So Benny, when he finished his solo, got through playing, he turned to me, and Harold Ashby had walked to the other end of the group that was on the stage playing. And Benny said, "What did I do?" I said, "Don't talk to me." He fell off the bench.
Phil, I think you had another comment. Phil Schaff.
Well, we might point out that Harold Ashby would therefore be the second coming of Ben Webster in that story, because he follows him. But I wanted to say a few words for some of the people who can't be here. The first would be bassist Curly Russell, who was in Benny Carter's orchestra when they were in California and working on Stormy Weather. And I was thinking of this strongly during the period when Loren was asking Ed and Hilma and Joyce to speak of some of the efforts on integration. And according to Curly Russell, since he was working on the film, the band itself wasn't working that much, and this was problematic. And Benny, through perhaps the connections with Alfred Newman or whatever, were getting them gigs integrating, the first soundtrack recording integrated, and I said, "Oh, Stormy Weather," to Curly Russell. He said, "No, I had no idea what movie it was for. We just came in and played some music. It wasn't jazz." He got us to break the color line in studio musicians in California. And this was a very, very long time ago, and he said it was very important gig work too, you know, to tide them over. And another person I want to speak for was Russell Procope, who grew up with Benny Carter in the San Juan Hill area. Russell Procope played the West End. He had an Ellington repertoire thing called Russell Procope's Ellingtonia. And Benny Carter was in New York, not all that often, but one particular time he was in town the week that Russell was at the West End, and he came up several nights to hear him. And, you know, you don't really think of Benny Carter as playing trivia, although I now know he could beat us at that too, because he and Russell Procope played trivia. The name of the person, you had to name their apartment building address and the apartment they lived in. And which one was the older brother and which was, and they did this, and it was a rather amazing thing to do. Of course, I have no way to say who was right and who was wrong, but Procope said, he got them all right, he wins, he's still the king. And another person who couldn't be here, and this is just a story of Benny Carter and his relationships with the common person. When he was working at the West End, by West End standards, he was a fairly well-paid performer, and he not only got his money for the gig, but he got a percentage of the receipts. And so the money varied from night to night, and our night manager, Brian Flanagan, would, you know, do the calculation. It wasn't that calculators hadn't been invented yet, but he, you know, did it either in his head or on a scratch pad, and he'd give Benny Carter the money, and Benny would put it in his pocket. And finally, I remember on a Saturday night, Mr. Carter, that's a sizable amount of money in cash. A reissue of the Deluxe 78s with liner notes, and people have been kind of timid about calling names. I'm not really sure what the person's name is, but he signs his liner notes Morgan. And this is almost 20 years ago, and the last paragraph began, "Sadly, Benny passed away a few years ago." So I thought, well, here's a sense of humor. I selected that record, and I took it upstairs, and Benny signed it. And now that's a collector's item.
All right, well, I'll tell you what, this, I used to hear Phil say on the radio for many years when we were getting towards the end, you'd say, "Now we're rounding third base," or something like you'd say. And we're kind of coming home here because this has been an extended love fest for the one only Benny Carter. I'd like to open it up to the audience just real quick. We all had a chance to talk about it. Are there any questions or any comments, anything from the audience? Ah, okay. How you doing? I didn't see you come in.
Yeah, I came in. I'm Paula Morris, and my mother recorded with Benny in 1941, and when he was 75 years old.
Maxine Sullivan.
Oh, Maxine Sullivan. Phil Schaff did a tribute to Benny Carter, 48 hours. Every room in our house had a radio in it playing for 48 hours of Benny Carter. About 1:30 in the morning, Phil played the album which he recorded with, my mother recorded with him. And all she tells me, she could never forget how he called the whole band and the singer around 12 midnight because he'd gone over the takes and he wanted to redo it. And she said he was such a perfectionist, he used to get you on grace notes. That's how particular he was. And also, getting back to Benny loaning his book, or showing his book to young people, Loren, when we did those Hank O'Neill gigs on the Norway, he brought the book, and the house band, Chip Holer, he conducted the house band there, and these young kids were so in awe to hear this and to be playing with Benny recording.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, I guess to start to close, first of all, I'd like to thank Hilma and Joyce for coming and gracing us with your presence, because now we're with the family, with Benny. And I'd like to say that on behalf of the Jazz Museum in Harlem, to remind you all of where we're at and what we're doing and what this is all about, we are looking seriously at a site for the museum, and we're making great progress on that. But even before the site is agreed upon with the powers that be, we're doing these kind of events. We would love to have you be further members of our Jazz Museum family. Come back, take postcards. We do these things twice a month. We're also this month having a film series at the Museum of the City of New York, starting this coming Sunday, which we have a flyer about over there. I think they're free. I'm pretty sure. I think it's free.
Museum admission.
It's museum admission.
And no extra food.
And no extra.
Benny's birthday.
Well, that's what I was getting to, is that Benny's birthday would be this coming Sunday, and he would have been 97, if I'm not mistaken. 97 years old.
Wow.
So, all I can say is on behalf of everyone here, thank you, and again, thanks to Hilma and to Joyce so much for coming. And I'd like to tell you just real quickly about our next event, which is coming up in 2 weeks, in which we're saluting a great writer on jazz who's told so many other people's stories. He himself has not been interviewed, and that's Clarence Atkins. Of course, he made all the money with the diet. No, I'm kidding. That was someone else. He's so thin, he doesn't need the Atkins diet. So we hope we'll see you in 2 weeks, and now we're going to present our plaque, our honorary Jazz Museum plaque, to Joyce and to Hilma. And thank you so much for coming, and hang out, have some food, and some flowers. Thank you, Greg. For you. And if I could do this too, we'll take a picture. Stand right up here. Greg?
Oh, stand over here, folks. There you go. Thank you.
So we another one that sang lower. Lower. One that sang really famous.
That was something. Putting that together, I've been wanting How are you? It's good to see you. Oh, okay. Really close. That's all right. Let's go.
I'm just doing this for a hobby. Go ahead. You have to hang this on you.
Thank you.
Well,
I know. Everybody else?
Yeah, this.
Joe has to come in the game. Joe. Can you take one when Joe comes?
Oh, Miles.
Joe.
Hey, Joe Miles.
Joe.
Yeah, Joe Miles. Where's the time?
Push it all the way.
Everything, Joe.
Right, Joe. Come on, Joe.
You want a supermarket? Great. Great. Joe Miles. Yeah, I got a thousand. Here you go.
Here we go.
Phil.
He's tall.
Right there. He got a wide angle.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
What's that other one? What's that ring? This picture is your hand.
Let me take a picture of your hand.
Did the flash go off?
All right, I got you.
Oh, right.
You have your camera? Yeah, I've got it right here.
Let me get a shot.
Good to see you. I ask about you all the time. So great to see Oh, he was gone. Hey, and Jimmy tell you, like in our band, it was the preciseness that put everything, everything, like, yeah, well, now don't you I got him.
We're going together.
Yeah, you got any problems? Pretty happy. He made
Sure, I saw your name and I No, I just said this is something that we're
I'm under contract, but this will violate my contract.
Thank you. Thank
I'm going to send it to you.
Yes, I know. We didn't dance together.
Yes, he was there. He was there.